Our first module is going to begin with networking concepts, and here's where we're going to lay out the basics. Make sure everybody understands the terms we're going to use in networking, and just answer questions about what it takes to make a network function. So let's take a look at the objectives. We're going to talk about the basics, and here's where we'll define those terms that we hear and take for granted. For example, the OSI reference model, a framework, a node, a host, a protocol, and a port. And even though these may seem like very basic terms, as you're getting into networking, you want to make sure you have a strong understanding of them. As I mentioned, the OSI reference model isn't something people just know automatically, and it's a really important foundational idea as it applies to networking. So we'll talk about what it is to have a framework and what the purpose of that framework is. We'll be looking at two frameworks, the OSI reference model and the TCP/IP model. These will help us understand networking at a bit of a deeper level. Then we'll move on to protocols and ports. Protocols are necessary in order to enable communication between hosts. They're basically a set of rules and regulations about how that communication is going to happen, so it's important to look at some of the more common protocols. Some of those you may have heard of, and some may be new. We'll also take a look at an upper level of network services, DHCP and DNS. We'll get into what some of these ideas are on a much deeper level as we move forward in the course, but to start, we just want to lay out the groundwork. We'll also talk about storage and our data and where it lives, so to speak. We can have storage on the network, we can have storage in the cloud, we can have storage on a different network, and we'll look at some of those options. And then we're going to wrap up this section with remote access. Most of what we'll talk about in the class is going to reference you're physically connected to a local area network. But in the case of remote access, you might be connecting from a VPN or some other external source. So how that works and the materials, equipment, and tools we need to make that operate will all be covered in this section. Okay, so jumping into network basics. The first question we have to ask is, what is a network? We take some of these things for granted, but I just want to be clear when we talk about a network, we're looking at a group of interconnected systems, and usually they're connected together for the purpose of sharing. Sharing data or sharing resources, like maybe a printer or some other tools on the network. So it's all about bringing these systems together and allowing them to access some of the same resources. In order to do that, we have to have the systems themselves, a framework that provides the structure for how we're going to communicate, and the clients and the servers that both need operating systems. We'll have to think about protocols and how the data, like media, will traverse the network. The easy answer for media is cable, but we have to think about the airwaves too, because of wireless connectivity. Then we have our network connectivity devices like our hubs, switches, and routers. Then we have network services that put it all together and make it work. Starting out, the first thing to define after defining a network is a system. When we talk about a system, there are different elements working together for a common goal, which is a very broad definition. You can see I have a bit more of an in-depth definition on the slide. Interconnected components which transform, store, transport, or control data and/or information for a particular purpose. I don't like to read definitions for you, as I know you can read for yourselves, but if you think about that, systems is a very inclusive term. We've even got different types of systems. Honestly, I don't want you to worry too much about someone saying node versus host or host versus client, because a lot of these terms are used interchangeably. For instance, if you look at node, it's defined as any addressable device on the network. So that's your laptops or desktop computers, but it's also your routers, storage devices, or network-attached storage devices, a cluster, or all of these things. If you can address it or access it on the network, it's a node. A host is a type of node, and that generally indicates a computer system. Types of hosts are servers or clients. Servers are computer systems, generally speaking, that provide a service like data or access to a printer, any sort of service on the network like DNS, and the clients are the ones that access the resources of that server. So, you can see there's not a huge difference between these terms, and people will say node or host, but for the most part, we're generally just referring to network devices. The one you will hear that we do usually make a discrepancy with is clients and servers. Think of clients, for the most part, as end-user workstations when you're sitting at your desk, and think of server as where you log on to the domain, access DNS, or your database or file server. What makes a network is often the operating system. I can have 15 client computers connected and running Windows 10, and I have a network, but I have what we used to call back in the olden days, or as my son says, anything prior to 2010, a peer-to-peer network. We didn't have a formal domain environment. We just had a group of connected computers. We can do that with a client-based operating system, and those will be what you're most familiar with. When I say client-based operating system, I'm talking about Windows 10, Red Hat for Linux, basically just the client operating systems. When we move to a client-server environment where we need a domain or realm created, and we want centralized control, central login, and central security to have a true network environment that we see in the workplace, we need at least one. But likely multiple servers running a network operating system, and that network operating system might be the latest version of Windows Server like 2016 or 2020, Unix, or Oracle Solaris. Back in the day, we had Novell, which is even in the olden days for me, but those are all network-based operating systems. Ultimately, with your network-based operating systems, they create this kind of virtual logical grouping of computers and clients that come onto the network and access the authentication server, which allows them onto the network. Usually, that authentication server passes out policy, manages access requirements to join the network, and validates credentials. So, the environments we're going to be working in today and focusing on throughout the class are domain-based environments. You'll have client operating systems, and you'll have a server that's the domain controller that's running the network operating system.